Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Wesley, and I'm the Dean of the College of Asia and the Pacific here at the ANU. And I've got to say, participating, opening Indonesia updates is one of my favourite parts of this job because it brings such a rush of pride. We meet here on a very special piece of land. This is a land that people have been meeting on for over 20,000 years. And I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also would like to particularly thank Ms. Julie Heckscher from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. A lot of what we do around Indonesian studies here at the ANU would not be possible without the financial support that we receive from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We've been receiving this support for over 50 years. Our Indonesia project, which is a major sponsor of this conference, has been running since 1968. And that's a symbol of the terrific partnership that we have with the Australian government. I also want to thank Julie for her personal support for what we do, not only on Indonesia, but on Southeast Asia studies here at the ANU. So Julie, thank you for that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pride that I open this conference today. We've been holding Indonesia updates here since the 1990s. They have been attracting regularly hundreds of people from across Canberra, across Australia and around the world. They are truly a landmark conference, and I know of no other annual conference that looks in depth at Indonesia anywhere else in the world. So that's an enormous source of pride to me. It also, I think, draws attention to the ANU's remarkable intellectual legacy in terms of people such as Heinz Arndt, for example, Jamie Mackey, real major figures in the field of Indonesian studies, and of course our wonderful current crop of Indonesianists, many of whom will be speaking today, and our emerging Indonesianists as well. And I'd like to particularly acknowledge Eve Warburton and Tom Power for all of their work in helping establish this conference. So look, I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our specialists are saying. There's a lot going on in Indonesia these days, and I'm going to hand over to, who am I handing over to? You, Toni? To Toni Erskine, the Director of the Coral Bell School for Asia Pacific Affairs. Thank you.
No, I know. I think there's somebody else who's going to speak before we turn to me.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry, I am Julie Heckscher, and I am really here as a figurehead, and it's a figurehead for many decades of diplomats in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade who have both supported the Indonesia project and the Indonesia studies here at ANU, but have also benefited from it. I think one of the things that I really commend the team at ANU for is the fact that we have this very rich exchange, constant, between the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and ANU on a multiplicity of Indonesia subjects. Indonesia is never boring. Indonesia is one of the most critical relationships for Australia. I mean, that's saying the blindingly obvious. But it is the kind of relationship that we are in the process of deepening across so many facets of our engagement, right across the archipelago of Indonesia, but right across Australia and all the different sectors. And the kind of intellectual, challenging exchanges that we and everyone in my team, and there are many members of my team scattered around the audience this morning, the depth of that relationship is incredibly strong. It's incredibly rich, and it's exactly the way that policymakers, people who are out there doing business for Australian government should actually have. with academics, with great thinkers, with people who both challenge us, support us, give us great ideas, and make us think differently about the things that we are working on every day. So for me, this is an incredibly important thing. I was really pleased to gong it open last year. Apparently, I gonged it quite hard in my enthusiasm for Indonesia and the Indonesia project. So if I gong it slightly less hard this year, it is no diminution of enthusiasm, but concern for the strength of the Indonesia project gong itself. I do want to thank ANU both for giving us an opportunity to be here and to continue that really rich intellectual exchange that we enjoy. Contestation, challenge, support, thinking. Those are all the elements that we should have as DFAT with all of you, and that's what we really expect to hear more about over the next couple of days. So thank you to ANU, thank you to all of you. Thank you in advance for all the ideas that you're going to give us and the thoughts that we will have. Very much thank you, Michael, for overstating my importance at this event, but certainly not overstating the importance of ANU and the Indonesia project for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is... Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, dear. I'll start speaking now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Toni, Erskine, and I'm director of the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to chair this first panel this morning on electoral success and democratic deterioration. Now, we have two presentations this morning. The first one will be a joint presentation by two of my colleagues, Professor Ed Aspinall and Associate Professor Marcus Mietzner, both in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs here at ANU. I'll turn over, Ed, are you going first? Marcus is going first, of course. And Marcus, I'll give you 20 minutes to speak. And there'll be ample time for questions at the end of both presentations.
Okay, thank you very much. And there's a lot to go through, so let's get right to it. As you see from the title here, which is slightly different from what you see in the program, Ed and I believe that the two main developments in Indonesian politics in 2019 are the successful and competitive elections of April in this year. But the second and equally important one is an increasing rise in illiberalism. Now, and that may seem like a paradox, but as we will explain in our presentation, the two things are in fact related. So we need to go through 5 steps here. First, I will talk about Indonesia's electoral democracy. We will be arguing that the April elections have confirmed Indonesia's status as an electoral democracy and its continued competitiveness. But then in the second step, I will be talking about the democratic regression that also continues at the same time. And the two elements of that democratic regression, of course, are the rise in Islamism and executive illiberalism as a response to that from the Jokowi government. Thirdly, Ed will then talk about the decline of the parties that was also visible in the elections, the deepening polarization then in the fourth part, a polarization really that we have not seen to that extent since the 1950s. And finally, Ed will pull it all together to a conclusion beyond normal politics, and he will also talk about Papua there as necessary, of course, given the developments in the last 2 weeks. But let's start with the good news, and that is that the April 2019 elections have confirmed that Indonesia remains an electoral democracy. And that is important for the framework of this conference. That is important in terms of the discussion that we're having about democratic decline in Indonesia. Indonesia is not an authoritarian regime. It is not a dictatorship. It is not a failed state, as some have claimed. What the other side of the people who advocate the notion of democratic decline are in fact claiming, no, Indonesia remains an electoral democracy. What does that actually mean? In political science terms, electoral democracy is the most fundamental, most minimalist, most basic level of a democracy. It means that a democracy has free, fair, competitive elections in a regular manner, has universal suffrage, has access to media information, and there is an absence of massive electoral fraud. That's the definition by Freedom House, and by that definition, Indonesia remains an electoral democracy. However, equally important is to make the point that Indonesia is not one of the more superior levels, if you will, of democratic development. Authors use terms like liberal democracy, consolidated democracy, full democracy, as the Economist's Democracy Index would do. Indonesia is not at any of those levels, but it does remain an electoral democracy. And here's the reason why. So here you see the result of the presidential elections of 2019 in April. The incumbent President Joko Widodo won with about 55.5% of the vote. His challenger, who has also been the challenger in 2014, gained 44.5%. You see the map here based on the results per district. Sort of the brownish districts here are the ones won by Prabowo and the red ones by Jokowi. The message that this map sends you is that Indonesia's electoral map remains highly competitive. And the result that you see here on that slide needs to be read in the context of Jokowi's ambition to gain at least 60% of the vote. He was obsessed with that number. His predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, had received 60% of the vote, both in 2004 and 2009. And so Jokowi had told his advisors again and again, that is the number he wanted. And yet, with all that he had at his disposal, the advantages of incumbency, the grip over the bureaucracy, the military, the police, the siding of the media with his campaign, he did not get much beyond his 2014 result, which was 53%, which he at the time achieved as an outsider without the advantages of incumbency and so forth. So all he gained from a massive attempt to use his incumbency to mobilize voters for him was a gain of about 2%. Now, the good news from that is that proves the point that Indonesian presidents in the contemporary polity are unable to coerce an election result for themselves across the vast archipelago. As you see here, he was unable to get into a lot of the areas in Sumatra, in West Java, Sulawesi, and NTT. Important here also to note is that these were the areas that he wanted to win the most. He had spent a lot of resources, a lot of time on Sumatra, on West Java, and that was entirely unsuccessful. In West Java, both in West Java and Banten, he actually lost votes in many of the provinces in Sumatra as well. He lost about 30% from an already weak result in Aceh from 2014. He lost 30% of the votes as well in South Sulawesi. In West Sumatra, for instance, he was left with a result of 14%. Now, that was a province he had declared very clearly that he wanted to do much better than in the past. So one good news to register here, Indonesia remains competitive. It is very, very difficult for incumbent presidents to mobilize an election result for them according to their designs. And that was despite a lot of effort. Here you see Bupatis, district heads of West Sumatra, coming together at several occasions And 12 of the 19 of the district heads of West Sumatra did so. They supported Jokowi. They declared their support for Jokowi. That was part of a massive and systematic campaign from the Jokowi government to enlist the support of district heads and governors for their campaign. There were 360 out of the roughly 500 district heads that were enlisted for the re-election campaign, and 30 of the 34 governors. So here you have one of these events, West Sumatra, Bupati's district heads coming together, declaring their support for Jokowi, despite the fact that they knew this was a very difficult province for Jokowi to win. And indeed, he lost 10% in that province. He went down from 24% to only 14% left for him there. Now, the reason is that it was not in the interest of a lot of the district heads, a lot of the governors, a lot of the local politicians on the ground to side with the incumbent in this particular election, because they knew that would undermine their much more important local interests that they had to defend. These were interests related to patronage networks that were deeply embedded in districts and provinces, and therefore the request from the Jokowi government to side with them in the election was detrimental to their own interests. Here you see a photograph of the daughter of the district head of Buru, where I went to in early April, late March this year in Maluku. She campaigned, but she did not campaign for Jokowi as her party had told her to do. She was running for Golkar. She campaigned for herself and for her brother and her cousins, who were all running for seats in the local parliament. This was in Namlea, the capital of Buru, where Jokowi is traditionally weak. The result at the end was, and I spoke to her afterwards, I said, so why didn't you mention Jokowi? You were supposed to campaign for him. That's what your party told you to do. She said, no, that would be political suicide. What I'm interested in here is my own campaign. What I'm interested in is my brother, my cousin. That is my priority. And indeed, she won her seat. Her brother won the seat, the cousin won the seat, but Jokowi lost in a landslide in Namlea. So here you have the major explanation for why Indonesia's political system remains so competitive. It consists of a myriad of localized patronage networks that have other interests than just the presidency. And the dispersal of power, if you like, and the dispersal of interests on the ground rebel against any attempt by the center to coerce a particular centralized presidential campaign, whether that's from the Jokowi side, and that, of course, was the greatest push here, or from the other side as well. Equally, you had 245,000 people running for office in this election at various levels, from the national to the district level. And the presidential campaigns had hoped, probably naively so, that these candidates would be the major agents of the presidential campaigns on the ground. The reality was entirely different. Very few of the parliamentary candidates that were affiliated with the presidential candidates actually campaigned for the presidential candidates, although they had been explicitly ordered by the campaigns to do so. PDIP, for instance, the government party chaired by Megawati Sukarnoputri, issued a very clear regulation that everyone who was running for PDIP across the archipelago would have to put Jokowi's picture on their campaign material and campaign for him when they did so. Now here you see a campaign poster in Ambon. This particular PDIP candidate chose to put her dead father on the campaign material because she believed that was what would bring in the votes. Her father, Alex Litai, former Secretary General of PDIP, was seen as a much bigger drawing card than Jokowi would have been in Ambon. And that was a general pattern across Indonesia. The failure of the presidential campaign, particularly on the Jokowi side, to utilize parliamentary candidates for their central presidential campaign. And here you have it again, interests, localized interests, patronage interests on the ground that refuse to be instrumentalized for a centralized campaign, leading to a much weaker result than the president had anticipated. We also have this continued competitiveness in the party system. Here you see the results overall. No party received more than 20%. We have a widely dispersed power pattern within the parliament. Again, PDIP very disappointed with the result because they had hoped for a so-called presidential coattail effect by which President Jokowi's popularity would pull the party up. That didn't happen. Likewise, for Gerindra, not a great increase here as well. The party that had supported Prabowo, not a great increase. So we do have, in a continued manner, a highly fragmented party system, one that remains competitive and rebels against the rise of a hegemonic party. The competitiveness also is expressed in the incumbency turnover rate here at the national level, which sits at 50%, which is very high in international standards. That means that 50% of incumbents who run for re-election, and 94% of them did, lose office. That's slightly down from 2014, but nevertheless, it remains by international standard a very, very, very high level of incumbency turnover, which in turn shows the continued competitiveness of the system. Now we come, however, to the second element that's equally important, and that's intertwined with the electoral success, and that's democratic regression. And we do believe that this democratic regression is happening. And before we go into the details of that, let me just define what we mean by democratic regression. Again, it does not mean that Indonesia falls back into the times of autocracy. It does not mean that Indonesia falls back into dictatorship or even a failed state. What we mean by democratic regression is simply the notion that Indonesian democracy at one point reached a level from which it since has declined. That's all democratic regression means. So if you look here at the VDEM index, which is arguably the best one to use, this is an index that combines electoral and non-electoral elements into an index of deliberative democracy. You see here how Indonesia performed during the colonial period. Then you see a spike in the 1950s. Then, of course, a long period of autocracy. Indonesia then in 1999 becomes a democracy. It reaches its peak in 2006, and that's when we see the decline beginning. Right? That's what we mean by democratic regression. Not democratic collapse, not democratic breakdown, not democratic reversal, but democratic decline, erosion, backsliding from that peak in 2006. And the latest number VDEM has would put Indonesia at the lowest level of democratic quality since 2000, but again, still way higher than under the new order. So quickly, what is the cause for a lot of the most recent decline? Of course, it has to do with the rise of Islamism in the wake of the Islamist mobilization against the Christian Chinese governor of Jakarta, Ahok, in 2016 and 2017, but also at the same time the response by the government towards that Islamist mobilization. So on the one hand, and that's important to note here, we do not put the responsibility for democratic decline solely at the foot of the Jokowi government, but in fact the trigger for it is to a large extent the Islamist mobilization, which was supported by his rival Prabowo. However, the way the government responded to it with a wave of measures that you could in combination describe as executive illiberalism has further pushed Indonesia down in terms of its democratic quality. You see here General Wiranto, who is a new order general, one of Suharto's adjutants, the last military commander of the new order, who Jokowi has chosen as the face of his response towards Islamism, here announcing that the government in 2017 took the right to disband social organizations, and it used that right subsequently to ban Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. Now let me go through some of the most important elements of this executive illiberalism. Here you have a major case that, and I see from the reaction in the crowd, this is a character who is not very likable, I give you that. However, and that's the quality of democracies. Democracies have to deal in a professional and neutral manner, even with people like Ahmad Dhani, who is a rock star, again, not very popular with the Jokowi crowd. However, he was put in prison for a number of tweets. In one of the tweets, he said that the Ahok supporters deserve to be spat in the face. In another tweet, he simply called his opponents idiots. For the first tweet, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. For the second one, for an additional year in prison. That kept him off the campaign trail. He was a very effective campaigner for Prabowo in 2014. He also ran for his own seat for Gerindra, wasn't able to do that. Importantly, the Jokowi government did not only target prominent representatives of the Prabowo camp, but also its grassroots representatives. Here you have a 22-year-old from Bandar Lampung, who described Jokowi in a Facebook post as a dog who only cares about Jakarta and should care more about Lampung. That was worth for the court to give him 18 months in prison for that. Altogether, we've had 82 cases, 16 convictions until now, of cases in which Prabowo supporters insulting Jokowi were arrested by the police and put on trial. There is also, Ross Tapsell has just written about this and is about to be published, a completely different stream as well, but very similar patterns that indeed, if you look just at hoaxes, disinformation, the supporters of Prabowo were much more likely to be arrested, to be put on trial, than those from the Jokowi camp. So we in fact have no information whatsoever on people who supported Jokowi, who insulted Prabowo, and there were lots of them. Everyone who followed the campaign will know it was a very robust campaign on both sides, but the pattern was very one-sided. The ones that insulted Jokowi were very likely to become the target of the police. The supporters of Prabowo weren't. The supporters of Jokowi weren't. That comes on top of the continued exiling of Habib Rizik, who of course would have been a very effective campaigner for Prabowo. He did appear in some of the main campaign events to support Prabowo, but of course he would have been much more effective had he actually been on the ground. Now, I'm running out of time. Just one particular and very important issue here. Here you see all the media tycoons who supported the Jokowi campaign, and that was a complete reversal from 2014. In 2014, the Prabowo campaign had on its side most of the TV stations, the radio stations. After that, Jokowi reached out to a lot of these tycoons, partly by using the police. So you see here Haritano, the man in the top left here, who controls about 40% of the media market, the television market. He was enlisted into the Jokowi campaign by the police, effectively, because they threatened him with legal action over a case that was unrelated to anything he was doing in the political sphere. So he had supported Prabowo in 2014. After that threat by the police, he switched sides. His media outlets switched sides, and Jokowi had very favorable coverage. You see also here on the right, Khairul Tanjung. He was promised to be on the list of potential vice presidential candidates. That kept him on side, so he directed his media companies to support Jokowi. On the right, on the bottom, you see Electoral here, who became the head of the campaign team and also directed his media to support him. And then you have Bakri with TV1 and Surya Paloh with Metro TV as well, who were supporting Jokowi. So a completely changed media landscape, almost carpet coverage for Jokowi this time around. I won't have time. It's interesting to go into this. There were also indications of the TNI and the police getting into the mobilization of voters, getting them to the ballot box, because there was a fear that low turnout would disadvantage Jokowi, and at that moment the police and the military became involved. There was also the Minister of the Interior who opened up a loophole for civil servants to get engaged in the campaign. And if you wonder how all of that is important for our topic of democratic decline, here you have it. You have the criminalization of Prabowo supporters, which of course undermines the crucial role of police in neutral law enforcement. You have the streamlining of the media. You have the politicization of the military after 20 years of attempts to get the military out of politics. And you have the involvements by bureaucrats, as sanctioned by the Minister of the Interior, that also made Indonesia's democratic quality decline further. And with that, I hand over to Ed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Now we'll turn to my colleague, Professor Ed Aspinall. Ed.
Thank you. So Marcus has told us about these various processes of democratic decline that are related to purposive governmental actions from the centre, these attempts to produce an electoral victory for Jokowi. But there are also slow-moving structural processes that have been in training for several years now, or even several electoral cycles, that we also saw plenty of evidence of this year. And one of them is the continuing decline of the parties as a central organising institutions of Indonesian democracy. Of course, parties are a very important, though often underappreciated, element of a successful democracy. When they work well, parties are able to aggregate social interests, ensure that public policy conforms with societal expectations and so on. But in the Indonesian case, we've seen that parties have been, the role of party has been declining. Now, of course, as Marcus has already said, in many ways, the legislative elections this year were quite successful on the surface. The results were not so dissimilar to previous years. But underneath the surface, what we see is a continuation of a shift that's been visible for several electoral cycles. The shift away from the parties as being the key actors in elections towards individual candidates being the critical actors. And this process has been particularly visible since the 2009 election, so a couple of elections ago, when Indonesia adopted what's called an open list proportional representation system, whereby individual voters can vote either for a party symbol or for individual candidates running for that party. The effect of that shift, which was highly predictable, was that the main axis of competition on the ground level during legislative elections, shifts from being between parties to being between candidates from the same party. The cause of that being that individual candidates will typically see their inner party running mates as their main rivals for the seats to be attained by that particular party in their district. And this is also, by the way, why counting the results of Indonesian legislative elections has become so complicated and time-consuming, as we can see in this picture here from Gunung Kidul. Now, the results of this shift of the axis of legislative elections to inter-individual competition are really very clear. It means that individual candidates, when they're trying to build up their individual vote tallies, can't really rely on their party symbols, their party platforms, their party identities, because their chief rivals are running under the symbols, platforms and identities of the same parties, of the same party. So as a result, individuals turn to other methods, one of which is cash. So if you've ever wondered what 8 billion rupiah, that's about 800,000 Australian dollars, looks like when it's divided into 400,000 envelopes and stacked into 84 cardboard boxes, well, this year the KPK showed us when it ran this sting operation on Sidik Bowo, a Golkar politician who was running for office. Arresting him for bribes he'd been taking for various public procurement and deals and projects and so on, and he was funneling that money into his vote buying operation, the so-called dawn attacks Serangan Fajar, in his election campaign in Java. And the point is that this has really become a very dominant form of election campaigning in legislative elections, and that we saw plenty of it this year. When we travel around the country, right around Indonesia, we see evidence of this pretty much in every village, in every kampung, in every neighbourhood, that most candidates rely on patronage strategies of one form or another. If they don't rely on money, very often, the majority of them are relying on other forms of gifting. For example, this lamppost was part of a strategy for a candidate from PAN that I was in a village in Gunung Kidul where I was visiting. The effect, of course, massive expenditure is required by candidates who wish to win elections, accelerating processes of elite capture, and producing greater evidence for what Marcus and I call in the paper a process of pilkadaization of the legislative elections. It's been known for about 15 years now that the local legislative elections, the pilkada, have produced forms of elite capture in Indonesian elections. Powerful individuals, the so-called oligarchs, dominate elections, local executive elections, and we see this same phenomena, this same dynamic increasingly taking place in legislative elections as well. Indeed, some of the results at the party level also reflect this shift. So one of the very few significant winners of the legislative election this year was the Partai Nasdem, the National Democratic Party, led by Surya Paloh, one of the media tycoons Marcus has already mentioned. That party had the biggest jump in its vote. It bumped up from 6.7% in 2014 to 9% in 2019, and it really did so as a result of its explicit strategy of recruiting powerful local figures, relatives of Bupati or Wali Kota, district heads and so on around the country in order to bump up its electoral results in the region. So, for example, we're working with a number of researchers in West Sumatra who had this amazing interview data showing how Surya Paloh had been ringing around the Bupati in West Sumatra who are affiliated to his party in order to command them to get their wives to run for office. And indeed, one of the other side results of this pilkadaization or oligarchization of the legislative elections is indeed the continuing pretty low results for women candidates in Indonesian elections. The numbers went up from about 14% to about 20.5% women candidates winning this year. But you can see how women candidates who often lack the sort of political networks, the on-the-ground networks and the financial resources are disadvantaged in this sort of a system despite the 30% quota on candidates. Next really major phenomena that we note in electoral dynamics this year is something that Marcus has already alluded to, and that's the growing polarization that was evident both in the campaign period and in the results. And this is sort of ironic in the sense, in the context of the personalization of legislative elections, the fragmentation of the elite that Marcus has already referred to. That these factors could not arrest the growing polarization of Indonesian electoral dynamics. And the basic dynamics of this polarization have really already been sketched out by Marcus, that the foundations of them are really socio-religious. The foundations of this polarization is really socio-religious, with Islamists and those supporting a more Islamic future of Indonesia, of Indonesian politics and society, lining up behind Prabowo, with pluralists, members of religious minorities, members of the more pluralist-oriented parties like the PDIP, and also affiliates of the traditionalist Islamic organization Nahdlatul Ulama, on the whole lining up behind Jokowi. So Marcus has already given you one version of the map of the Indonesian results, and as he mentioned before, one of the striking similarities we can see here for students of Indonesian history is really the similarity with the election results of 1955, this very socio-religiously oriented election at the very early period of the history of the Indonesian Republic. So Prabowo pretty much winning in areas that had been won by the Masyumi party, the Islamist party, back 60 years ago, and Jokowi primarily winning in areas that had formerly been won by the PNI, the Nationalists, Nahdlatul Ulama, the traditionalist Muslims, or the fourth largest party at that time as well. On the whole, we see a polarization in the results as well. So Jokowi are doing extremely well in areas dominated by religious minorities like Bali, and in fact improving on his results in those areas. So Bali, for example, his vote went up from 71% in 2014 to 92% in 2019. North Sulawesi up from 54% to 72%. So Bali, of course, Hindu-dominated, North Sulawesi dominated by Protestants. And the similar, the flip side of that, in these areas with these strong Islamist traditions, the most dramatic of which was perhaps Aceh, where Prabowo's vote jumped from 55 to 86%. And we see these results also reflected in the some of the exit poll data produced by, in this case, Indikator Politik Indonesia. On the left, you can see up here this really dramatic, incredibly dramatic result, actually, that according to this exit poll, 97% of non-Muslims voted for Jokowi. On the right-hand side there, the really important result we see here is that 56% of the supporters of Nahdlatul Ulama also supported Jokowi. And it's really in the combination of those two figures that we see the explanation for Jokowi's victory. And that result for Jokowi on the Nahdlatul Ulama side, I should say, is a significant jump from 2014. Why did this polarization happen? Well, Marcus again has already introduced this. We're really talking about the continuation of the dynamic of socio-religious polarization that was set in after the anti-Ahok campaign of 2016-2017. And this was really visible, highly visible in, for example, the major election campaign events. So this is a photo from the last major election campaign rally in Jakarta held by Prabowo, which you can see had very much the flavor of a reunion of the so-called 212 movement, this movement that had mobilized on the streets to bring Ahok down and to end up putting him in jail. If you look carefully at the top of that photo, you can see a picture of Habib Rizik being beamed in live from Saudi Arabia, singing a rousing song at that time. And obviously a very enthusiastic audience, very happy audience, but one that was almost entirely Islamist in its cultural and political orientation. The final rally of Jokowi, on the other hand, for the Jokowi supporters, on the other hand, had a completely different flavour, much more plural sort of crowd, rock singers, and, well, all sorts of people. We also saw some of this reflected in particularly one particular moment in one of the final televised debates, when Prabowo sort of lost his cool at one point and accused Jokowi supporters of accusing him of supporting a caliphate, the formation of a caliphate in Indonesia. And Jokowi turned around and said, well, you know, your supporters accuse me of being a communist, so we're sort of even. And that was very much the flavour that we encountered at the ground in the tenor of the campaigning around the presidential election. So there was a highly polarised climate in all parts of Indonesia that we visited, with each side increasingly depicting the other as some sort of existential threat to themselves or to their vision of Indonesia. For example, I spent a bit of time in Central and East Java, meeting people from Nahdlatul Ulama, this very large traditionalist Islamic organisation, and there was a very, obviously a very systematic attempt going on through that organisation to depict the Prabowo camp and the Islamist groups backing it as being a threat to the Nahdlatul Ulama community, to their traditional Islamic practices, and to a pluralist vision of Indonesia in the future. Now, obviously, there's a patronage politics element to this sort of competition. Nahdlatul Ulama, of course, has been one of the big winners of the Jokowi government, with very significant representation in cabinet and with all the patronage jobs, patronage resources which come with that. But nevertheless, this was very much manifested on the ground as a sort of battle about identity. And we see this also in Christian areas. I didn't visit these sorts of areas so much, but Marcus certainly did, and we also saw reports from Eastern Indonesia, from NTT, places like that, where very much the tenor was, well, that other side, they came for Ahok, next they're going to come for us unless we get around behind Jokowi. And of course, we saw very similar rhetoric being distributed, espoused amongst the Prabowo supporters, especially in places like West Sumatra, Aceh, Islamic areas of Maluku and North Maluku and so on, where Jokowi and his team were accused of, well, a lot of the recycling of the old sort of hoaxes and stories of the 2014 election, actually, that backed by Chinese, that Jokowi is a secret Christian, he has plans to ban the call to prayer, that he's going to legalise same-sex marriage, all this sort of stuff. So a very highly polarised political climate. Why does polarisation matter in the context of the big topic we're interested in, democratic decline? Well, I think Eve Warburton will be talking about this a little later on. But there's pretty clear findings from the comparative literature on democratic decline that high levels of polarisation are very much often a handmaiden of democratic deterioration. The problem is that polarisation means that political actors often come to place greater value on harming their enemies than on upholding democratic norms and institutions. And I think we can certainly see evidence of this in contemporary Indonesia, partly in the processes of executive illiberalism that Marcus has already talked about, but also in the immediate aftermath of the election, when we saw the return of large-scale rioting to Jakarta for the first time really after 20 years. And Prabowo supporters, or some of them at least, basically trying to overturn the results through violence, but many Jokowi supporters as well, really applauding, cheering on the security forces, the military and the police, despite the significant violence that was obviously being meted out against Prabowo people. And again, wild stories of conspiracies on either side, all of which were unfortunately plausible given the identities of some of the former generals and others that are distributed on both sides of the political spectrum. So we saw, after this period, of course, we saw a return of some of the familiar rituals of political reconciliation that we know about in Indonesia. Jokowi and Prabowo had this sort of, I guess it was a sort of an awkward meeting in an MRT. But despite this, I mean, we shouldn't have any illusions that Indonesia has come out of this election with a much more polarized political climate. And we can see evidence of this, for example, in some recent media reports about government plans to implement more systematic purges of the civil service to identify and remove Islamists from positions of influence within the bureaucracy. So conclusion then, so I'll try and be quick here. So our basic argument is that Indonesia really has, over the last few years, entered a new phase of its post-Suharto political history. And we see evidence of this year. So when we look at the politics, the election year of 2019, we certainly do see plenty of continuities. On the one hand, as Marcus has emphasised, Indonesia still is very much a functioning electoral democracy with high levels of inter-elite competition. The second point, I guess, where we can identify a continuity is that Indonesia, yes, is still burdened by some underlying structural problems which have been present, sort of shadowing Indonesia's democratic development ever since the transition from Suharto began 20 years ago. And I think it's in that context, really, that we need to position the Papua protests of the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. In some ways, this is a really remarkable series of events. In other ways, it's quite unremarkable and very much in keeping with the place of Papua in post-Suharto Indonesia. It's remarkable, of course, because it's the biggest wave of protests that we've seen in Papua around the Papua issue ever since the so-called Papuan Spring of 1999-2000. Also, I think it's significant in that there's a new framing of these protests in terms of anti-racism, triggered by the fact that there was this, when the original attack on this Papuan student dormitory in Surabaya, when people called some of the Papuan residents of that dormitory monkeys, and that produced this backlash, understandably so, amongst many Papuans. Also, the scale of this wave of protests has been remarkable, with phenomena such as the burning of the DPRD building in Manokwari. In fact, protests, it seems, in pretty much every urban centre in Papua province, West Papua province, highland, lowland, basically everywhere. But in other ways, this protest is really unremarkable. This wave of protest is unremarkable insofar as it accords with the place of Papua, as I said before, in post-Suharto Indonesia. It's very much consistent with the patterns of management and resistance that we've seen in Papua, at least since the Gus Dur presidency. It's the latest of many sort of demonstrations of this sort of irreconcilable and in many ways unwinnable contest between the force of Papuan nationalism and Indonesian nationalism, and the unbending will of the central government not to allow Papuan nationalism and Papuan calls for independence to triumph. And we should remember as well, when we look at the phenomenon of executive illiberalism that Marcus has described, that in fact the use of charges of treason have been a regular part of political behaviour or of politics in Papua really for many, many years. So the fact that Papua is sort of an island of exception to the general patterns of Indonesian democracy is really quite a long-standing fact. So back to what makes this year exceptional, therefore, I think if we compare the last few years and these events that have been really brought home during this election year, is what's shifted in Indonesia is that, yes, Indonesia has been an electoral democracy. Yes, there are these underlying structural problems, these islands of exception, such as those in Papua. But what's really shifted over the last year has been the advent of new measures of purposeful erosion of democratic rights and freedoms by the central government. And the growing polarization that underpins and justifies that erosion of democratic rights and freedoms. And unfortunately, 2019 really provided quite a lot of evidence to support this sort of analysis of Indonesian democracy. Again, we don't want to exaggerate this. As Marcus emphasised from the start, Indonesia is and remains an electoral democracy. Even the extent of democratic erosion is not as severe as we see in many other countries experiencing executive illiberalism around the world. Indonesia is not at the level of Turkey, it's not at the level of Hungary or those sorts of countries. But it's this confluence of structural weaknesses with deliberate governmental actions, which really means that Indonesia, we believe, has really definitively entered a new phase of its political history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. I'm now very pleased to invite our discussant, Dr. Charlotte Setijadi from the Singapore Management University, to speak for about 15 minutes. Charlotte.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Great. First of all, while we're waiting, I just want to say thank you for the Indonesia program here at the ANU for inviting me, particularly to Eve and also Tom for having me here. Wow, discussing Marcus and Ed. This is daunting, and trust me, I'm daunted. So let me just say, I agree with everything they say. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the update. But yeah, all jokes aside, I thank you so much, Ed and Marcus, for, as usual, a really eye-opening paper, extremely detailed and really informative for all of us in trying to understand what happened in the last election and what we can learn from it. First of all, I do agree with Marcus and Ed's main argument that the 2019 elections confirm the ongoing status of Indonesia's competitive electoral democracy. As Ed and Marcus analyzed in great detail, this is despite the decline in political parties, attempts to mobilize state agencies and local actors for Jokowi's re-election campaign. So, from this perspective, analysts and observers who are worried about the state of Indonesia's democracy can feel somewhat encouraged by the resilient competitiveness of the electoral system. Having said that, however, we turn to the second part of Marcus and Ed's argument that despite still being a competitive electoral democracy, the quality of Indonesia's democracy is showing alarming signs of decline. As Ed and Marcus so richly described, this democratic decline can be attributed to a number of things, mainly to do with the rise of personality and Islamist identity politics, as well as also the Jokowi government's illiberal reactions to the president's oppositions. So, as revealed in post-election data, some of which will be analyzed over the next 2 days, this democratic decline also contributes to the widening political and socio-religious polarization that we are seeing in Indonesia today. I would like to take this opportunity to offer 2 points of consideration that stem from Marcus and Ed's paper. The first is that while it is true that we need to continue to pay close attention to illiberal tendencies at the executive level, equally or perhaps even more alarming is what appears to be a growing illiberal mindset at the societal level. Secondly, I would like to consider what clues Jokowi's patterns of behavior so far and his approach to the presidency may tell us about what his second presidency will look like. I'll start with the first point regarding the importance for scholars and analysts to better understand the trend of growing illiberal mindset at the societal level, particularly among the more progressive members of Indonesian society. Have I done something with the thing? Oh, I'm so sorry. I can see things flashing, but I didn't quite know what was going on. Okay, sorry, I'll try not to do that. Okay. Over the last 2 Indonesia updates in particular, we have heard many great papers delivered from this podium that analyze Jokowi government's aggressive responses to what it perceived to be the threat of anti-democratic Islamist populism from the opposition side. In the next 2 days, we will hear more about how, by engaging in what Marcus and Ed in their paper called the systematic operation of executive illiberalism, policies designed to protect Indonesia's democracy and pluralism, ironically, has the effect of accelerating Indonesia's democratic decline. Indeed, we are familiar with many examples of this systematic operation of executive illiberalism, some of which was already mentioned by Marcus and Ed, such as the jailing of several of the president's opponents under the charge of makar or treason, and anti-government groups that were disciplined, or in the case of Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia, banned. Under Jokowi's first presidency, we also saw a greater amplification of the Pancasila rhetoric for the first time since the oppressive days of the New Order. This is reflective of how Jokowi has tried and has continued to try to combat Islamist populism with hyper-nationalist rhetoric. Since then, Jokowi has repeatedly said in speeches that his government will show no tolerance to anti-Pancasila groups and those who threaten Indonesia's national unity. This kind of move to combat Islamist populism with hyper-nationalist rhetoric has proven to be quite popular, especially among Jokowi supporters, and is perhaps best encapsulated by the popularity of the chanting slogan NKRI Harga Mati, that can roughly be translated as the unity of the Republic of Indonesia at the price of death. This slogan implies that the unity of Indonesia should be defended at all costs, even at the cost of civil liberties. Throughout the 2019 campaign season, President Jokowi's supporters, even those from strong civil society backgrounds, defended the president's illiberal moves, deeming them as necessary moves to ensure that Jokowi is re-elected and to keep those who threaten Indonesia's pluralism and democracy at bay. The push to ensure that Jokowi gets re-elected at all costs also meant that even candidates who are more progressive engaged in dirty attacks focused on the opposition's personal histories, families, ethnicities, and religious credentials, basically identity politics. I certainly saw this on the ground. At a Jakarta campaign rally for a PDIP national MP candidate who himself is an ethnic minority, the candidate spoke to the crowd about Jokowi's character and family, how he is a good Muslim, good husband, good father, good grandfather, especially with his celebrity grandson, Jan Etes. The candidate claimed that Prabowo, on the other hand, is divorced, not a particularly devout Muslim, and his son, well, his son's certainly not married. And who knows what he gets up to, said the candidates as he winked and gave the crowd a smirk, knowing full well that the crowd understood his allusion to rumors that Prabowo's son, Didet Hadiprasetyo, is gay. The crowd erupted in laughter. I was baffled. I had followed this particular candidate since the 2014 elections, and I had never heard him make such homophobic jokes, especially since he at least used to claim to be a pluralist and a defender of minority rights. I spoke about this to his campaign manager afterwards, and the manager said, "Oh, don't worry about that. He's just towing the party line. He doesn't mean it, and perhaps, the opposition started this whole identity politics thing anyway. So we are just being pragmatic." Just like the president, I thought. For me as an anthropologist, these trends are really worrying. To my mind, this indicates a turn to perhaps more accurately, a return towards an illiberal societal mentality, and also the public's weakening support for civil society in post-Suharto Indonesia. There seems to be a tendency here to focus on short-term goals rather than on understanding how present-day illiberal trends may have long-term repercussions that will last long after Jokowi is gone. So now we have this open-ended question of why we are seeing this growing illiberal mindset. Is it because Indonesians are growing tired of the seeming chaos of the democratic processes and thus beginning to have nostalgia about the more predictable days of authoritarianism? In his 2017 political update, Vedi Hadis pointed out that the absence of a viable pluralist alternative meant that Indonesia's progressives had no other option but to rally behind Jokowi. I think that these explanations to this growing illiberal societal mindset lie at the crossroads of these different factors. I know that tomorrow Diego Fossati and Burhanuddin Mutadi will present their respective analysis on the contemporary public support for democracy. So this is something I'm personally very much looking forward to. No pressure, guys. Now, about his second term, questions are being asked now about what his second presidency is going to look like. What is Jokowi the man going to do this time around? How is he going to bridge the huge gap left behind by ethno-religious polarization in the aftermath of his first presidency? Is he going to accelerate the political and economic reforms he has been promising from his first election? Most importantly, many are hoping that we will see a more liberal and progressive Jokowi now that he no longer has to worry about re-election. I, for one, I'm afraid I'm not so optimistic about the prospects of a more progressive and liberal Jokowi. I don't know about you. While it is true that he no longer has the burden of winning a re-election, nothing much has actually changed in terms of the circumstances that frames his presidency. It is true that Jokowi has a slightly stronger mandate and his coalition is slightly more solid this time around. However, Jokowi still needs to juggle domestic political pressures and appease members of both his party and coalition. Analysts have predominantly focused on the figure of Jokowi and what he will personally do. But as we have seen in Jokowi's first-term presidency, those around him have considerable power in shaping his presidency. Here, some mechanisms for further democratic decline is certainly already in place, with more looking like it is about to come soon. Later this month, the parliament is expected to approve amendments to the penal code that would criminalize contempt of the president and vice president, as well as that of the government, state agencies, and courts. As Marcus and Ned mentioned, soon after the election, his own party PDIP tabled a proposal to amend the current iteration of the 1945 Constitution. This amendment could include a return to the old ways of indirect election of the president, where the president is elected by the People's Consultative Assembly, or the MPR, instead of directly by the people. And certainly members of his own coalition have given indication that they support this amendment. Jokowi himself has said that he opposes the idea, but the decision ultimately won't be up to him. In terms of dealing with identity politics and polarization, Jokowi has tended to downplay the seriousness of societal divisions, insisting that they can easily be overcome. His go-to solution has been to try to refocus the attention to his pet agenda of development and infrastructure building. His conciliatory meeting with Prabowo was, of course, as Ed showed, done at the Jakarta MRT, also an opportunity to showcase his infrastructure achievements. And before his second term even officially began, Jokowi announced that the capital city is going to be moved to East Kalimantan in what is going to be a massive and expensive undertaking. These are classic Jokowi moves. Furthermore, those who hope that his second term will become more progressive, people who expect that second-term presidencies are going to be more progressive are often disappointed. For instance, as discussed in the 2014 update, concerned with preserving his own legacies and plagued by indecision, President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, for instance, was even more conservative in his second term. For me, one of the main indicators of Jokowi's commitment to Indonesia's democracy will be how his government protects minorities and civil society in this second term. And already at the very beginning of his second term, as Ed mentioned, Jokowi is faced with the difficult task of dealing with the current unrest in Papua. In order to resolve the situation in Papua, Jokowi needs to display a deep understanding of the complexity of issues like Papuan identity, human rights, the desire for self-determination, and the long history of racism, marginalization, and the oppression of Papuans in Indonesia, which again lie at the root of the unrest this time around. But so far, there is little sign of this deeper understanding, with Jokowi already saying that he will focus on continuing an approach based on development and prosperity to deal with this unrest. Indeed, compared to other Indonesian presidents in the past, Jokowi has put more attention and money into Papua. Jokowi's development-based approach has focused on developing infrastructure such as the Trans-Papuan Road Project and funding injections for health, education, and security. This has paid off for him, where in the 2019 election, he won with over 90% of the vote in the province. However, Jokowi needs to understand that this developmentalist approach is not enough, and that he needs to take leadership in dealing with identity-based politics and long-standing problems of injustice and inequality at the heart of the problem. In many ways, I think how Jokowi deals with the unrest in Papua will be a reflection of how he will handle inherent problems in Indonesia's democracy in his second term. Those who voted for him did so at least partly because they believed that he is a more liberal and progressive leader, particularly among the minority. Many ignored and justified his illiberal and authoritarian tendencies so far, and his ardent supporters hope that he will be a different kind of president the second time around. Will we see a more liberal Jokowi in the second term? I guess we'll see, but hopefully. In the meantime, I have no doubt that scholars will continue to scrutinize his track records and keep Jokowi and his government accountable, as what we are going to do here over the next 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Now we have just over 20 minutes for questions from the audience. I think I'll take about 3 questions at once. And I understand that the first 2 sessions this morning are also being live streamed on Facebook. So we might have some questions from our online community. And there are microphones as well. Can I just see where the microphones are? There, we have a gentleman in the middle here, right with the, nearer to me.
Oh, sorry.
Near the front, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Budi Roso Sudarmo, an economist from the Indonesia project. So I'm econom. So this is a question of a layman. So I just wonder. I certainly agree. First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. I certainly agree with what you say about this changing sort of level of democratization in Indonesia. However, so I'm not going to reject those arguments, but I just want to say two puzzles in my mind. The first one is that you also mentioned that the structure of Indonesian society in terms of religiosity and in terms of ethnicity does not change much within 50 years. So the question is that, number one is that, so if this fundamental do not change, and we just see from our portrait there has been a change, it is really the way that one, there is a random event that have been happening. So what is happening? So we need to look at a counterfactual situation. Do Megawati or SBY, in which the democratization was high, will react different if they face the same cases as Jokowi faced right now? I have a doubt that Megawati particularly will behave different, but those parameters has been changed. Now, second is that I think we need to also take into account the way that this picture of democracy coming up by the new development of new technology, the way that we capture those things has been changed. So then fluctuation could be seen much better than what actually it is. So then if you take into account those things, the fact of counterfactual and the fact that the way that we take a picture has been different, do the change, yes, I do, I'm not against it, there is a change, but do the change is significant enough to talk about? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Can we take a second question, please? There's a gentleman. Oh, sorry. Yep, right over here, please. I'm sorry, I'm making you run around.
That's all right, we've got a couple of mics.
Oh, you've got a couple. Okay, wonderful.
My name is Prayudi from University of Newcastle. Thank you for the very good presentations, very interesting. But also no less interesting for me is what happened, the maneuvers of the political actors post-elections. As of last night, the news is that Hendro Priyono having a meeting with Prabowo Subianto, and he also claimed that he also had a meeting with SBY before. The meeting was about membicarakan masalah kebangsaan, like dealing with like national things. I would like to. This is interesting for me because we all know that in both sides, former military generals had played significant roles in the way to the elections, and also in the working of the government. So I'm wondering, what would be your comment in how the former military strongmen in Indonesia, in both sides of the Jokowi and Prabowo sides, may have any roles or influence in somehow affecting what you call the declining of democratization in Indonesia and also the deepening polarization. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we do have a third question from our online Facebook community.
Yes.
Please.
This comes from Erlina watching through Facebook. If the role of parties is declining and the campaigns turn into individual candidates, what explains the increase of PKS 3 million votes from 6.79 to 8.21%?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to go through our speakers, I think, in reverse order. If there are any comments or responses to the question, Charlotte, you're okay? Ed, I'll pass on to you then.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll take the first and the second. So for Budi, right? I mean, the question is if the counterfactual, if it was SBY, if it was Mega, would they be different? I mean, I think our argument really is a structural one in that there are these political structural shifts taking place. Not necessarily structural shifts in the sort of basic socio-religious composition of the population, although of course Islamization has been a long-term factor. Well, anyway, I mean, the basic point would be, I think that, I mean, it's an interesting question. Obviously, Mega wouldn't respond any differently. I mean, probably she would even be a little bit more hardline, you could imagine. I mean, SBY did have a different approach to governance, though, right? I mean, he did have the approach of the all-inclusive rainbow coalitions. And you could argue that part of what has given the Islamist mobilizations against Jokowi such force has been the exclusion of some of those actors from government and therefore from access to patronage resources. Obviously, PKS has been excluded, whereas PKS was a significant beneficiary of governmental patronage, as we know, during the SBY period. Also, one underlying dynamic I would say in this polarization is competition between Muhammadiyah and NU. Recall from earlier this year when Said Akil, the NU leader, talked about how NU people should be entrusted to be, every imam in every masjid, in every mosque, should control all the local offices of departments of education, and there was a whole list of other sort of functions that NU people should control. Which of course is going to exacerbate socio-political polarization. So you can see how there is a sort of a connection between governing style or governing coalition and the nature of political polarization. Maybe I'll just leave the next two to Marcus.
Marcus.
To Budi as well, I mean, the data shows very clearly that especially in the middle class, the educated, the high-income middle class, there has been a significant increase in conservative attitudes and endorsement of Islamist political themes. That was particularly prevalent since the Ahok demonstrations, and that is the very particular challenge Jokowi is responding to. So I fully agree with you, in fact, that Megawati would respond to it in a much more hardline way, and in fact she does. If you see what she has been saying at the recent Congress, she believes there is now this war between the pluralists and the Islamists on the one side, and PDIP is taking a very hardline stance on the side of the pluralists. On the part of the role of the retired military, I can only say yes, obviously, that is a major problem. They're on both sides. If you have, and that was interesting, during the riots in Jakarta on the 21st to the 23rd of May, that the two main figures in that were Wiranto and Prabowo. That really said it all. You know, here were the two figures who played a huge role in the 1998 riots in Jakarta. And once again, 21 years later, here we have them again being on different sides of the political equation. And that tells you a lot about the democratic decline, the democratic stagnation, the democratic problems that Indonesia has to get rid of that heritage. You know, not even talking about the baggage of Hendro Priyono that you just mentioned. About PKS, that's a very interesting case. In fact, it totally fits into what Ed has been saying, because if you look at how PKS got its numbers up, they had a very specific campaign of approaching the wives of incumbents, of bupatis, of governors, and so forth to run for them, and they bumped up the vote for them. So we have the statistics on that from a research project on female representation. So perfectly fine and in line with that argument of personalization.
Wonderful. I'm going to take three more questions. I've got a question over here to start. And then there's one back here, the gentleman with the green shirt there.
Thanks. Ben Bland.
Please go ahead.
Ben Bland from the Lowy Institute. I've got a question about Jokowi himself, because he's clearly profited from the competitive elections more than anyone else in Indonesia, going from mayor of Solo to presidency. but at the same time, he's proven to be a very poor guardian of the democratic principles you were talking about. So how are we to understand this? Is he simply not interested in the ideas of democracy? He's more interested in roads than rights? Or does this reflect his more illiberal foundations, being as he is personally a product of the Suharto era? So how can we understand this personal contradiction within Jokowi? Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Yes, please introduce yourself as well.
Thank you. My name is Yogi Vidyatama. I'm from University of Canberra. I have a question regarding bureaucrat. And both Marcus and Edward touched bureaucrat at the end of their presentation. And I just would like to know about the use of bureaucrats that being touched again, especially by the incumbent, given that the survey actually show that most of the bureaucrats actually support the opposition at the time. Thank you.
Thank you. And we've got one question behind you there.
Thank you very much. Farid Sainong from Council for International Development, Wellington. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was wondering about the polarization, and that would lead us to say about the decline or stagnancy of democratic life in Indonesia. The context is quite different from what we had in 1955, where the candidate at that time came from Islamist party or from Islamist groups, while what we had in the last 20 years, whether they were supported by Islamist movement or Islamist groups, they still come from nationalist side. 46% of what Prabowo got today is too many for the real number of Islamists in Indonesia. So what PKS also got, well, get more support this in this election, but it's not significant. Well, and my short comment simply, well, they are small but louder. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll start with Marcus this time, if that's all right, Marcus.
Yeah, okay. I'll leave the Jokowi question to Ed. He just asked for this one. So the use of the bureaucracy, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to go into that slide that I couldn't explain properly. So the Minister of the Interior, Cahyo Kumolo, in March 2019 said that yes, bureaucrats, civil servants had to be neutral in campaigns. However, if they were asked by their superiors, bupatis, district heads, mayors, governors, to help the government promote the achievements during the campaign, they would be required to do so. Now, that, of course, needed to be read in the context of the government having enlisted 360 of the district heads and mayors and 30 of the 35 governors. There was quite some outcry over it. There was a concrete case in Central Java where that became relevant, where the governor had called in 31, I think, of the 34 district heads and had asked them to support Jokowi, and they all enthusiastically agreed with that. Now, of course, all of these 31 district heads had bureaucratic apparatuses under them. Jokowi, as we know, gained 10% in Central Java, got up from 67 to 76%, so huge landslide. We don't know exactly, of course, what role the bureaucracy played in that, but there was certainly an open question about it. In terms of the polarization, we thankfully now have quite good numbers about the percentage of Islamists in Indonesia, or citizens who endorse Islamist ideas. And I have always said for the last years, do not look at party results. They don't really tell you anything about the support for Islamist support, PKS and so forth, because these parties have undergone processes of mainstreaming as well. So it's much better to actually check attitudes through opinion surveys. And we put the number of Muslims who endorse Islamist ideas, hardcore Islamist ideas, at the moment at about 27%. And it's been increasing over the last few years. So that is increasing. And so the comparison with 1955 is difficult in the sense that we do not have the opinion polling data then. But Masyumi at the time was, in fact, an Islamist party because it was openly calling for Sharia. So its vote share is a much better indicator of Islamism at the time than it would be today in terms of PKS.
So on Jokowi, thanks. It's an interesting question. One thing I do recall about Jokowi, not from this election, but from the last one in 2014, was that there was one of the debate questions in the public debate at that time. Both Prabowo and Jokowi were asked to explain what democracy meant to them. And Jokowi gave this answer, which was very characteristic of him, but also showed that he didn't have what you would call a highly developed view on what democracy means. He said democracy means going out amongst the people, listening to the people, being close to the people, being one with the people, something like that. And I mean, and I think that is a view that is very distinctive of him. So he is clearly a strong defender of electoralism. So in recent times, there's been floated this idea to re-empower the NPR, the People's Consultative Assembly, and he's come out and said, no, he doesn't want to do that. He's a product of direct elections and he wants to defend them. But insofar that he doesn't demonstrate a strong understanding of or support for some of the liberal underpinnings of democracy. In fact, that's quite representative of the political elite and the Indonesian population at large. So this is just to sort of give an advertisement to a forthcoming article that we have coming out with me, Diego Fossati, Yves Orbit and Burhanuddin Mutadi. So we surveyed members of the population and representatives from Indonesian provincial parliaments. And it shows very clearly that while there's strong support for elections and the electoral aspects of democracy, there's actually not much support or very few respondents have an understanding of democracy that emphasises some of those underpinning liberal protections, rights, control institutions, and so on. So in that respect, he's actually quite representative of Indonesian political opinion as a whole. Just one tiny little other thing, if I may, on bureaucrats. The interesting thing for me about this attempt to mobilise bureaucrats is this is really an upscaling of the standard approach that's used by incumbents in Pilkada, in regional governmental elections. So all around Indonesia, incumbent bupati and mayors typically rely on mobilisation of bureaucrats, although bureaucrats are not meant to be involved in politics, attempt to mobilise bureaucrats with the explicit or implicit threat that if they don't support the incumbent, they will be, with a phrase typically is di non-jobkan. You know, you'll be put in a non-job, you'll be parked in some non-functioning office where you don't have access to the benefits that come from a more lucrative position. So for me, that was a really interesting thing that in many ways the Jokowi government in many ways represents the upscaling of that very prosaic, development-oriented, day-to-day style politics that we see in local government in the presidential palace. Sorry, Toni.
No,
sorry.
fine.
No.
Charlotte, please go ahead.
No, maybe just to add a little bit to Ben's question before about Jokowi's attitude to democracy. And I fully agree with Ed, like that, that he doesn't show much understanding or I guess like in-depth knowledge so far about democratic processes and what democracy actually means. And it reminds me of a conversation I had recently with a senior government official in Jokowi's current government. And I asked him, okay, in the aftermath of the election, we see all these illiberal moves and identity politics. What do you think? Do you think the second term is going to be different? And he said, look, what you need to understand is Pak Jokowi is both pro-democracy, but on the other hand, he's also very pragmatic. Again, this pragmatism. And he said, and at the end of the day, people will get over it. People who, the same people who accuse him of being communist, of being Christian, of being Chinese, they maybe were angry at him for a little bit, but now they're in my office asking for, how they can play a part in the government. And Jokowi knows this. He's a ahli tukar sapi, you know, right? Dagang sapi. And so I think this also, and like you mentioned before, Ben, I think this is also because Jokowi is a product of his time, and he was, and that influences his understandings of democracy.
Thank you, Charlotte. Sadly, we're out of time. That hour and a half went incredibly quickly. That was a superb panel and a fantastic start to the day. I want to thank you, the audience, for your wonderful questions, including our online Facebook audience. And I'd like you to please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for their great presentation.